بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا Muhammad. وبعد. As Brother Faisal mentioned, actually these are 4 lectures that I gave in some other cities, and I could not figure out how to put them all into one lecture. So we decided just to, over time we'll inshallah complete all 4. And basically it's the discussion of the Modernist movement, which comes under a couple of names. Sometimes they're called Madhab al-Aqlaniyya, sometimes they're called Asriyun, and they have different names, but in essence we're talking about the same group of people, and we're talking about really a methodology, and how to understand Islam. These people have their own methodology, and inshallah in the last lecture, or actually in the last 2 lectures, the purpose of those last 2 lectures is to look at their methodology and compare it to the Qur'an and Sunnah, and see on what points they are correct in their methodology and on what points they are incorrect in their minhaj. Well, also during these lectures, and I may be referring to a number of people. One of the important points that I think I mentioned before in other lectures I've given is that whenever we talk about someone else's opinion or what someone else has said, and we do not know what is in the heart of that person. In other words, the person may have the right intention, but what he is saying is wrong. And if he has the right intention, but what he is saying is wrong, and we still have the obligation to object to what he's saying and to correct what he's saying. And some people, it seems, Allahu Alam, they have the intention, for example, to defend Islam or try to show that Islam is better than other ways of life, yet they do it in the wrong way. So their intention might be fine. This is between them and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But for us to accept what they did and to be silent, what they're doing has to be correct according to the Qur'an and Sunnah. If what they're doing is not correct according to the Qur'an and Sunnah, it is our obligation to point out that this is wrong and this is not proper. Secondly, there's some debate about whether I should mention the names of people. Al-Qasbi's madhab is that it's best not to mention names, and I agree with him and I also disagree with him. And in the past, for example, I would not mention actually the names of the people who I'm talking about. But it came to the point where people would say to me that these people you're talking about, they are unknown people, or like you're making some of these things up. Or you don't mention who they are explicitly, so they keep continuing to be popular, and people don't notice that these are the same people I was talking about. So then I realized that in some occasions at least, you have to mention them by name and give quotes from them, what they said and what they did and so forth.
What's really the hukm or the whatever it is? The sunnah, do we have any hadith to support either way?
You should not discuss someone's faults behind his back. But at the same time, if he's giving something which is like public fatwa, and it is like narrating a hadith which is wrong.
Well, that's probably like talking about.
Yeah. But even when it's allowed to talk about, it depends on you have to apply some hikmah or some maslaha, whether it's best to mention them or not to mention them. There's some occasions if you mention them, it will just lead to disaster. So don't mention them. But in this room, I don't think so. In Seattle, yes. But here in
you call them Ahl al-Bid'ah?
Eish.
The modern people?
Yeah, for sure. We'll get to that. Yeah. Don't. If you jump ahead, then no one will listen to what I'm going to say. The first thing we have to realize about this group of people who basically they are judging things according to their aql, and they are giving their aql or intellect or their rationale a special place. But one thing we have to realize about these people is actually their madhab, their way of thinking in essence is actually a very old madhab. And it goes back to the Greek days, group of people known as the rationalists, which is exactly the same thing as the aqlaniyah. Where they judged everything according to their aql, even just from a theoretical point of view. The original rationalists, they didn't do empirical studies. They didn't, like, for example, go to a lab and do some studies. But they just sat there in their room drinking coffee or whatever they were drinking at that time. And thinking from their aql. And whatever they could prove from their aql, this must be correct. And whatever cannot be proven by their aql, this has to be rejected. Well, the classic example in the history from the Greek times is Aristotle and Socrates. These two were the classic example of people putting relying completely on their aql. They made basically three mistakes. Well, their first mistake was they used aql, or they tried to use aql in things that it cannot completely comprehend. And you have to realize that there are some things in this world that the aql or the intellect at their time and until now does not comprehend. So if it's beyond the realm of aql, since these people respected the aql so much, they should respect it enough to know that this is something beyond the realm of intellect, and therefore they should not judge this thing using their intellect, because they're judging something that they do not have the ability to judge. The second mistake was to refer everything to aql and to accept only those things that the intellect accepted, and to reject those things that the intellect rejected. And in fact, there are some things in between. There are some things that the aql neither can accept nor can it reject, but it has to be quiet and it cannot say anything about it. And thirdly, also, the third mistake was that they judged revelation, or if there was any claim to revelation or anything coming from God, they judged that revelation and all of its aspects completely based on their aql. Now this madhab, or this school of philosophy, actually is very important for Muslim history. Because unfortunately, when the Muslims begin to deal in philosophy and begin to be influenced by Greek philosophy, the person that they were most influenced by was Aristotle. This person who saw no other source of knowledge except pure aql. In fact, actually, if we want to be more specific, this way of thinking, of judging everything based on their own aql, is a type of kibr, or type of arrogance, that we think that as human beings we have the right to judge everything based on our own aql. And in fact, it is one of the characteristics, they're following the footsteps of the shaitan, when after he was created said, قَالَ أَنَا خَيْرٌ مِّنْهُ خَلَقْتَنِي مِنْ نَارٍ وَخَلَقْتُهُ مِنْ طِينٍ. That he is actually using the same kind of reasoning that the modernists used, that he's saying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at the time, after he was ordered by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to prostrate to Adam, he's taking that order from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and he's judging it in his own way, saying that I am better than him, I should not prostrate to him, I am better than him because you created me from fire and you created him from clay. And this characteristic, unfortunately, as I said, it's passed on, many human beings, they follow the same way, as I said, the early rationalists. And with the coming of Islam and the pure teachings of Islam and the pure aqeedah of Islam, this way of thinking actually should have been done away with, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam gave us the general structure of something that we cannot deny. In other words, our aql cannot deny that the Qur'an is true. If we just study from a rational point of view, whether what the Qur'an says is true or not, or whether it is a revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and whether the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was sincere in his message and whether he was a true prophet, al-aql, an unbiased intellect will conclude that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was the true Prophet and the Qur'an is true. So if that's the case, if our intellect will lead us to that, then this means also, therefore, that everything in the Qur'an is true and everything that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said is true. And in other words, the intellect leads us to believe that the Qur'an and the Prophet are true. So that, the corollary of that, this means that everything in the Qur'an and everything that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said must be true. Otherwise, the first corollary is false. And the basic premise is false. So if someone says he's convinced by his aql that the Qur'an is true and the Prophet Muhammad is true, and then he takes statements from the Qur'an and Hadith and starts rejecting them, and he is in fact contradicting what his own intellect has concluded. But unfortunately, and especially as Islam began to spread to other areas and new people, especially non-Arabs, begin to embrace Islam. Many of them, they came into Islam with, in English we say they brought their old baggage, and they brought all their old stuff into Islam with them. And unfortunately, some of the Arab leaders also were influenced by them, such as the Khalifa al-Ma'mun, who established something called Dar al-Hikmah. Well, Dar al-Hikmah was a place for everyone to come and discuss philosophy and religion, whatever they want to discuss. Even there are Hindus there are Buddhists there, and so forth. And during his time, the books of the Greek philosophers were being translated into Arabic, and it began to influence the Muslims, and it led to the development of two sciences in Islamic history. One is the science of philosophy, and the other is the science of ilm al-kalam, which is what in English? Science of speech. Ilm al-kalam is, there's no one, I don't have to worry about what it is in English. So these two sciences developed, and as I said, unfortunately, they were both of these two sciences, especially the philosopher aspect. Both of these two sciences were influenced greatly by Aristotle's school, the Aristotelian school of thinking, which, as I said, this school believed that everything can be judged based on aql and aql alone. And if aql doesn't accept something, then it has to be rejected. Now also at that time, philosophy included, by the way, mathematics, physics, medicine. All of these things were included as part of what was known as philosophy. So many of the Muslims, when they saw how advanced the Greeks were in these other fields, in medicine and in astronomy and so forth, they thought that, well, they must also be advanced in philosophy also. So they began to take some of these ideas and even judge the Qur'an according to these ideas. That's right, yeah, that's what all you people are trying to get here, man. They begin to judge the Qur'an and the Sunnah, especially many hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, according to Greek philosophy. And for many of them, Greek philosophy was superior. And the reason Greek philosophy was superior, especially in philosophy or matters of aqidah, they said that in matters of aqidah, for something to be acceptable, it has to be thabit or confirmed by aql. Okay. So therefore, a rational argument, or an argument which is based on rational premises, this takes precedence over the Qur'an and Sunnah, which is not based on rational precedence. And in fact, there was a debate among the philosophers whether or not the Qur'an could be used as hujjah in aqidah. Because since it's not based on rational, then that means that therefore we cannot use it in matters of aqidah. Another group also that was influenced by that was the extreme philosophers that I was talking about. Another group that was influenced by the Greeks and who also put the aql or the intellect above the sharia is the group known as the Mu'tazila. Well, the Mu'tazila, since they were closer to the mainstream of Islam, they could not take the same position as the philosophers. They could not say that we'll reject the Qur'an or the Qur'an is not hujjah. So they were forced to accept the Qur'an. But at the same time, the Qur'an had there's many things in the Qur'an that goes against their madhab. So their only solution is to resort to something known as ta'wil, where basically you say that this is what the Qur'an says, but that's not what it means. And this was their only solution because they had to stick to the Qur'an. Well, if they have to stick to the Qur'an, this is the only thing that they could do. And as I said, also they said that al-aql takes precedence over al-naql. Yani al-aql or rational thought or the intellect takes precedence over anything which is narrated, especially hadith. Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, they, in particular, since they could not touch the Quran, they tried to attack the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Zamakhshari, who was very famous for his tafsir, one time الزمخشري said امشي في دينك تحت راية السلطان, والسلطان here he means العقل. امشي في دينك تحت راية السلطان ولا تقنع برواية فلان وفلان. You should, in your deen, don't rely on what has been narrated, for example, from the Prophet or from anyone, even from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because the Quran actually is a narration from the Prophet ﷺ, from the angel Jibreel, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he's saying that don't rely on these things, don't be convinced by these things, but you should walk in your deen. Not saying in dunya. He said go on your deen underneath the banner of al-aql, and do not be satisfied with the narrations that you receive. Also in his tafsir, he makes the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ seem just like, even he has actually bad words in one part of his tafsir, explaining the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, afallahu ank, talking about the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Zamakhshari talks about the Prophet ﷺ in very disrespectful terms. But also, with respect to the Sahaba, it is the same situation. One of the leaders of the Mu'tazila, he said, by Allah, wallahi, if Ali and Uthman and Taha and Zubair testified concerning a shoelace, I will not accept their testimony. Well, Zamakhshari also called Ibn Mas'ud in his tafsir, he called Ibn Mas'ud a liar. What led them to these things is that they found some things in the deen that their aql could not accept. So if their aql could not accept it, what could they do? What they had to do is they had to lower the position of the Quran and even lower the position of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and also of the Sahaba. And as I said, even with respect to the Quran, they would either make ta'wil, and sometimes even they would try to change the wording of the Quran, as the famous example from the Mu'tazila, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says وَكَلِمَ اللَّهُ مُوسَى تَكْلِيمًا, and they are not willing to accept the fact this attributes or gives the attribute of speech to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which goes completely against their madhab. So they changed the verse. Actually, they changed the verse from كَلَمَ اللَّهُ مُوسَى تَكْلِيمًا to كَلَمَ اللَّهَ مُوسَى تَكْلِيمًا, to change the one who's doing the action. And all of these things were the result actually of their placing al-aql before anything else. Also in tafsir, for example, their leading people, they reject many things in the Quran that have to do with al-ghayb, or the unseen. And as I said before, one of the mistakes of Aristotle and the early rationalists is that they use aql for things that al-aql cannot judge. For example, the unseen. Well, if you can't see it, how are you going to say whether it's true or not? But if they took that approach, that would at least be better. At least if they said, if they were silent and said, okay, we can't say whether that's true or not, that's fine. Well, that's not fine because the Quran maybe says it's true. But at least that's better than their approach. Their approach was, even if it's in the Quran, if they cannot prove it by aql, they will reject it. So for example, with respect to the jinn, many of the Mu'tazila, they reject the existence of the jinn. And based on this point that their aql cannot confirm it. And over time, this madhab and this way of thinking, alhamdulillah, it was dominated by the Ahl Sunnah wal Jamā'ah, and over time, basically, it died out. And the school, the modernist school that exists today, actually doesn't really have their roots in the Mu'tazila, although they have many similarities between the Mu'tazila and the Asriyun today. But that's not actually where their roots are from. Their roots are actually from Europe. And this group today, whether you want to call them, whatever you want to call them, the modernist movement, al-Atriyun, al-Madhab al-Aqlaniyya, Jafar Sheikh Idrisi insists, don't call them al-Aqlaniyya, they do not use the aql. But this is what they like to call themselves. And the root, or where this modern group came from, actually they have much closer ties with Europe than they have with the old Mu'tazila. And they developed from the same, basically around the same circumstances in which the movement in Europe came. So therefore we have to really understand this movement, we have to actually go to Europe and try to understand what happened in Europe. In Europe, during what they call the Middle Ages, the church, the Catholic Church, controlled everything, including sciences. Everything was under the control of the church. And if the church says something is true, you have to believe it is true. Otherwise, you're going to have a difficult life. But at the same time, because of Muslim Spain, they began to develop what is called the scientific method. But it's now called the scientific method. I forget there's 4 stages to it. I don't remember exactly what the hypothesis, observation, and so forth and so on. So they in other words, they begin not just rationalist, from their mind, but they begin to experiment. And from Islamic Spain, the people of Europe began to see and begin to realize that what was being taught by the church, and it was not actually true. And the church had many ideas at that time which the Muslims in Spain, and because of the scientific method, the people began to realize that actually what the church is teaching is not true. So they began a very slow revolt against the church. And there began to be a new breed of philosophers, and these are really the founders of the modernist school, or at least what they proposed led to the modernist school. For example, there was a philosopher by the name of Kant, or Kant, if you want to be more specific. Kant was a strong believer in God. And this is, by the way, a sign, as I said earlier, intention and action sometimes they do not go together. Kant was a very strong believer in God, and he thought that what he would be doing would be defending the religion by saying that the laws contained in Revelation, or divine laws, are actually work on a different sphere than human laws. In other words, divine revelation has nothing to do with actually what's going on in this world. He thought he's defending all of these false beliefs that the Christians had. But actually what this actually led to is that, okay, in that case, that means if we want guidance, just ignore the Bible. If we want guidance, just ignore what was what was always known as revelation, or what has come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And also Darwin's theory. Darwin's theory that human beings actually evolved from animals of other lower on the chain. Although his theory from the beginning was very weak, he never did find the missing link in his theory. But also this was very harmful for the church, because the church had always been teaching that God had created human beings and so forth, and this God had created Adam and Eve and so forth. And this theory also was something that when this theory spread, people began to question the Bible. And also another philosopher by the name of Descartes. Descartes also said that nature was like a machine. There's no spiritual element to it. And everything happens according to a law. And also Newton's law of causation also was the same. So in the West, there began all of these types of ideas. Basically, all of these ideas are saying that there's no room for religion, or revelation has really no purpose in guiding mankind. That everything basically is based on laws, and all we need to know to find out what is best is to study those laws, and we'll find out what is best for mankind. So we're not in need of revelation. So we now have the old God of the Greeks actually coming back. Now it's not just rational thought, but it's rational thought with some empiricism, some actually testing. And after that they came to the conclusion, as one of the philosophers said, his name was Nietzsche, he said, God is dead, and we have no need for God anymore. Now that we understand how the world works, we have no need for his revelation or anything, because everything is according to a law. We just discover those laws, and that's all we need. Now this way of thinking, actually, if you look at the modernists in the Muslim world, actually this is actually the source or the root of their way of thinking. But that's jumping ahead. We'll get to that. Destroying anyone's belief in Christianity or anyone's belief in Judaism. So they came up with the idea of modernism, or the modernist movement. Basically, that religion, and it's not something fixed, but it should change according to the circumstance. That's what the modernist movement basically is that not everything in the revelation is to be fixed, and we have to believe in it as it is, but it's supposed to change with the changing of culture and changing of environment and so forth. What that means actually is that there's no such thing as absolute truth. That's what they're saying. I mean, there's no such thing as absolute truth. That something may have been true at one time, and so therefore it was revealed to Moses or revealed to Jesus, but it's no longer true today. So therefore we need not apply it. And this is what the modernist school is all about. And this was the Jewish and the Christian response to what was going on in in Europe at that time. So therefore they came up with new theories how to explain, trying to explain how Judaism or how Christianity is still relevant today. And if the teachings are actually no longer relevant, what role does it play? So they tried to come up with a new form of Christianity, a new form of Judaism, and introducing new things into the religion so that people will somehow still stick to it. For example, Moses Mendelssohn, a Jewish leader, and he started a school which was teaching both Judaism and modern science at that time. And what they did in that school is that they noticed that the young people were interested in one thing and old Judaism said something else. So they decided to change Judaism to make sure that the young people don't leave Judaism. And some of the things that they did is the prayers used to has to be said in Hebrew. They changed it that it could be said in the local language. And they also introduced the use of musical instruments. And it is, if you go to the church nowadays, they sing from the beginning to the end. And also the Jewish synagogue, especially what they call the Reform or the liberal Jews, and they sing from the beginning to the end also. And these are actually recent developments. We're talking about the 19th century, the 1800s. And they introduced musical instruments. Similarly, there's basically three Jewish rabbis called Steinheim, Holdheim, and Geiger. They were basically the ones who led this new movement. For example, Geiger said that Judaism is an ongoing revolutionary process, and it keeps getting better over time. And he said that, and this is an important point, and he said that the Bible was collected by human beings, and therefore there's some things which are divine and some things that are human. How to know what's divine and what's human? Well, if it doesn't sound good anymore, it must be human. If it still sounds good, it must be divine. And because obviously the divine part, it should sound good forever. So if there's anything and so therefore, you are basically on your own. If you come to the Bible and you don't like something, you just say, well, that's from old days. And that's actually, if you look at Jews and Christians now, most of them, this is how they are. If you show them, this is what it says in the Bible, they say, come on, this is for old days. So the things, as I said, some of the things that they introduced into the Jewish religion, they said the prayer, it doesn't have to be in Hebrew. As I said, they introduced musical instruments. They said it's allowed for women to marry non-Jews, and this is all from the 19th century. They said it's allowed for women to mix with men. They changed the laws of divorce and so forth. And they made basically the changes that you see, actually still among them today. Now, although this movement started in Europe, it wasn't very successful in Europe. for many reasons. People were a little bit more conservative there, plus people knew their religion. So of course the place where it grew and developed was the United States. And these Jews moved to the United States, these Reformed Jews, and to the point that at one time all of the synagogues, all of the Jewish temples in the United States were reformed or liberal Jewish temples. And here when they came here, they had something known as the Pittsburgh Platform. They met together and they agreed, first of all, that the Old Testament was gathered together by human beings, so therefore it's not perfect. Any scientific invention does not contradict with Jewish beliefs, even if it contradicts with the Bible. In other words, Jewish belief is whatever has been proven by science. If it contradicts the Bible, we just neglect the Bible. Even including Darwinism. They said even Darwinism, the belief that we came from a gorilla or whatever, this is okay because we don't have to believe the Bible literally. And they also said that they no longer have to wear the traditional Jewish dress. And they even said that Judaism is a progressive religion, always in touch with Aql, and therefore it's possible for them to work with both Christians and Muslims, since both Christians and Muslims originally came from Judaism anyway. And they completely rejected the idea of the hereafter, al-akhirah. And they said to be a Jew, you just have to work for the best society that you can. This is modern, or what they call liberal Judaism. Now the same kind of thing happened among the Christians. Again, there is a problem between their belief and what science was proving. Especially their belief in the Trinity, 3 in 1 and 1 in 3 and so forth. And also they began to study the Bible closer, what they call higher criticism of the Bible, and they found that there was lots of contradictions in the Bible. So again, also the Christian leaders decided that therefore all of the Bible isn't divine. Some of it is human, some of it is from Allah. And also they began to study other religions, like the old Egyptian religions, the old Greek religions, and many of them came to the idea that religion is an evolutionary process. It keeps getting better. And so therefore it should keep getting better now. And if you talk to many Christians today, they'll tell you that revelation, wahi, is progressive and evolutionary. It's still happening, and we still keep getting a better and better religion. And therefore they came up with the idea that there is no absolute truth, and what the Bible says is not necessarily the truth forever, but it may have been true at one time, and so on. And this was basically, these were the leaders basically in the 19th century, in both the 18th and the 19th century. And this was unfortunately also the same time in which the Muslims once again started looking towards the West. This was the same time that the Europeans began to conquer some of the Muslim lands. This was the same time that the Muslims began to look to Europe and see that they're scientifically advanced, and began again to start taking the ideas of the Europeans or of the non-Muslims. As I said, last time, it was unfortunate that they took Aristotle's ideas. Well, now again, it was unfortunate because they took these ideas of these modernist thinkers. And for the Muslims, basically, there was three choices: either reject everything that the West had completely, or to accept everything that the West had completely, or try to see what should they accept and what they shouldn't accept. And there was no question that the Muslim world at that time was in a very from Islamic point of view, it was in a bad situation. And the Muslims had strayed far from Islam. And so therefore there were some reformers who tried to point out the mistakes that the Muslims were doing, and tried to point out what is correct from the Qur'an and Sunnah. But at the same time, unfortunately, these reformers were not as strong or as influential as those reformers who could really be called modernists. And basically these modernists developed in three areas. And they developed in these three areas basically because of the importance of these three areas. Number one, they developed in Turkey, because Turkey was the seat of the Khilafah. Number two was in the Indo-Pakistani subcontinent, because this is where the Europeans, especially the British, had lots of economic interests. And number 3, they developed in Egypt, because Egypt was the seat of Al-Azhar, the center of learning for the Muslim world. Al-Azhar was respected as the leading center of learning, so therefore the kuffar, when they realized this point, they concentrated on Egypt for that reason, and in particular on Azhar. In Turkey, of course, we all know what happened in Turkey. In Turkey, we had what is known as, it was a secularist revolution, or Almani. Now you have to realize, of course, that Almaniya and Modernists, they are not far apart. In fact, basically they are the same. The only difference between them is one is more blatant than the other. Al-Almani said, we don't have any need for religion, so let's just throw it all out and decide what we're going to follow and what we're not going to follow by ourselves. Okay. So they're very blatant. This is what Ataturk did. Okay. He said religion has no role in the nation, and we as human beings, we're going to decide what we're going to follow and what we're not going to follow. Of course, he didn't use his mind very much. He just took a law coming from Europe and applied it in Turkey. That's the secularist or the Almani way. The way of the modernist is basically the same. They're saying we're going to decide what to follow and what not to follow by ourselves. And human beings are going to decide what to follow and not to follow. But at the same time, we're going to put it in the name of religion. We're going to say we're going to follow this and follow that and follow this, and we're going to say that Islam says that's okay. While the people, the secularists say we're going to follow this and follow that, and they don't care what Islam has to say. But in essence, they're the same. In both cases, it is humans deciding what they'll follow and what they won't follow. In one case, they follow it, they do it in general. In the other case, they claim that they're following the Sharia, and they'll choose from the Sharia what they want to follow. So Ataturk, actually, I will leave him in discussion of what happened in Turkey for anyone who wants to talk about secularism as a separate topic. In the case of the Indo-Pak subcontinent, the leader of this movement was, his name was Sir Syed Ahmed Khan. And he always insisted on being called Sir. And Sir is a British term, meaning for someone, for giving someone respect. And he lived in the middle of the 19th century. In 1857, after the Muslims revolted against the British and they were defeated, this man, Syed Ahmed Khan, he came to the conclusion that the salvation or the success of the Muslims depends on cooperating and becoming the friends of the British. And also by adopting the way of the British culture. And he says that there's no enmity or there should be no hatred between Christians and Muslims, because it is the Muslims who have the greatest respect for Isa alayhi salam. So therefore, the two should get together. And then he started a publication, a magazine, and every issue of this magazine, what he tried to stress is how nice the British government is, and how they did this for the Muslims, and how they did that for the Muslims. And in order to achieve his goal, though, and in order to make the Muslims become more like the British, he had to give some fatwas, because at that time, for example, it was the Muslims would refuse to eat with the British, and they would not sit at the same table and eat with the British, and they would not eat the food of the British. So he gave fatwa, and in order to bring them together, that there's nothing wrong with sitting and eating at the same table. And in some of his other fatwa is that the polygamy, having more than one wife, is against the spirit of Islam, and so therefore it should be prohibited. The riba, or the interests that are in the modern banks and the business transactions that exist nowadays during his time, he said this is not actually riba, so therefore it is halal. He also says that the punishments, al-hudud, that are found in the Qur'an and Sunnah, he said these were only meant for a barbaric society that did not have prisons, so therefore they should be done away with. And he also said that jihad is forbidden except in the case of self-defense. And only if another country attacks you, should you actually fight. Well, he also said that Islam is completely completely consistent with science. And this term, you hear it a lot, and I think people say it and they have no idea what they're saying. Because science is actually of two types. Science which is real and science which is PhD type science. And science which is actual fact, and science which is theory, nothing proven. So he said that, and of course he's talking about science in the middle 1800s, which we know now that half of that science wasn't even true. But in order to prove that Islam was consistent with science and reason, aql, he said that all of the miracles in the Qur'an, the mu'jizat of the prophets, these are not true, they're all false. He said the angels don't exist, again, talking about something that actually aql cannot say whether angels exist or not since they don't see it. Also the jinn do not exist. Also the Prophet Isa was not born without a father. He said all of these things were not true because according to him they went against modern science. And he even said, he even compared revelation with the hallucinations of the insane. Someone is majnoon, he hears things. And he says this is similar to the revelation that the Prophet received. And with the help of the British, he was able to start a university. He started in 1878. This is the university is called Al-Agar University. And basically his goal of this university was to create a generation of Muslims who had similar beliefs to his. And in this university, the only language of teaching would be English. Even the Muslims at that time, they couldn't believe some of the things that Sayyid Ahmed Khan was doing. Even Jamāl al-Din al-Afghani said about him that the English authorities, the British saw that this person was very helpful for them. So they did their best to support him and give him honor, and they helped him by building that college. Unfortunately, he had many students, and these students their writings are still influential until today among the Indo-Pakistanis and even here in the United States. His students included Sayyid Amir Ali, who was a Shia, who wrote a book called The Spirit of Islam, very big book. It's one of the first books that I read about Islam. Basically, in this book he says that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ wrote the Qur'an as a human being, and he says sometimes he was wrong. And he says, what can we expect at that time? He was wrong here, he was wrong there. He points out places in the Qur'an which the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was wrong. And I found this book being sold at one of the Muslim conventions. And I told the people who were selling it, I said, this book is clear kufr, from the beginning to the end. And I explained to them some of the things that they said. But unfortunately, many people, they don't care much. When they're just selling books, they don't have any idea what they're selling. So this person said, oh, barakallahu fiqh, he put it away. I came back 3 hours later, there it was sitting on top of the table again, to be sold. And unfortunately, this book is, it's probably in maybe its 50th printing. And it is still being distributed. Well, Muhammad Ali also is one of his students, not the boxer. And Muhammad Ali was also one of his students. The Spirit of Islam. Muhammad Ali actually was Qadiani, and his translation of the Quran into English, which has very strange footnotes, is still one of the popular translations that exist in the United States today. And his other students included Khalifa Abdul Hakim, Ghulam Ahmed Farwis, who rejected the Sunnah, and many others of that. In other words, his school and his teachings actually, unfortunately, were not just talking about himself, but it really led to a new generation of writers and thinkers that propagated this modernist way of teaching. Huh? No, it was not one of his students. Because we don't have, we're running out of time. With respect to Egypt, I'll just talk about, and I guess so today we're just going to be discussing the history. We'll not get to what's happening today. With respect to Egypt, the leader of this madhab was basically Muhammad Abduh. Well, Muhammad Abdu was a very close friend of the ruler, of the English ruler Lloyd Cromer. Well, Muhammad Abdu was a very strong admirer of the European civilization. And he loved Europe very much. And he said, any time I feel depressed or bad when I'm in Egypt, I just go to Europe and it revives my soul. He loved to see Europe and the Europeans so much. And he said that the only hope for the Egyptians, was to follow the practice and follow the way of the Europeans. And in 1899, because of the British, he was appointed the Mufti of Egypt. Well, this position, of course, he was able to make, to really control the way of thinking and what was going on. Even he had the right to remove people from Al-Azhar. Basically, his aim, and again, we're not talking about his intention, whether his intention was good or bad, whether he understood Islam, didn't he? It's not important. That's not what I'm talking about. But by what he did, by his writings, we see that basically his intention, his aim, his goal, was to interpret the Sharia in such a way, and to free it from the old interpretations of the earlier scholars, and to prove that Islam and modern Western civilization, were compatible. Two of his best-known fatwa. One of them said that it is halal, or it is legal to make pictures and statues for the Muslims as long as there's no shirk. And in this fatwa, actually nowadays we're still living under the influence of this fatwa. And before Muhammad Abdu, you don't find this fatwa. Even two-dimensional pictures, it was considered haram by the ulama. And that's why when he gave this fatwa, and he was opposed by almost all of the ulama at that time. And also he also said that it is halal for Muslims to put their money in the European banks and to get interest. And he also said that it is permissible for Muslims to wear Western clothing. And that was the introduction of pants and these Western style clothing into Egypt. He was also, at the same time, he was convinced of the supremacy of Aql. He said Aql sits in judgment of Deen. And it is Aql who decides what is right and what is wrong in the Deen. And also, of course, he had to read this modern science into the Qur'an. So, for example, about the jinn, he said that the ulama of old, they used to say that the jinn are living bodies which cannot be seen. He says, but it is permissible to assert that the minute living bodies only recently discovered by means of the microscope and called microbes may well be defined as the jinn. And he is saying that jinn are microbes. This was just recently, you could not see it until we had the microscope. That's his only justification, for saying that jinn are, not just with respect to physical science, but also he said, that we have to adopt the social sciences of the West. And even he tried to prove again that Darwin's theory was compatible, with the Qur'an. طيب. Why, you don't want to hear the adhan? We don't have much time. If you want to ask, you can ask. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Hayya ala salah.
الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
Actually, Faisal was very tough for me to finish before the Adhan. That's why I'm trying to finish before the time of the Adhan. And to conclude about Muhammad Abdu, and probably the best conclusion that we can say about him is something that the English ruler Lloyd Cromer wrote about Muhammad Abdu. And Muhammad Abdu, by the way, he was put in prison for some time. So Lloyd Cromer said that under British pressure, the ruler pardoned him and then made him a judge. And Abdu recognized the necessity of European assistance in the work of reform. Then he said that he founded a school of thought in Egypt which is similar to that established in India by Sir Syed Ahmed Khan. And their task is therefore one of great difficulty, and they deserve all the encouragement and support which we can give them. They are the natural allies of the European reform. And Muhammad Abdu actually was used basically by the Europeans to try to spread his version of Islam in Egypt at that time. Muhammad Abdu, of course, was very influential. Included among his students were Qasim Amin, the one who wrote. Actually, it was his first book. Actually, it was Muhammad Abdu who wrote it, probably, but Qasim Amin put his name on it. Or they wrote it together at the minimum. Ali Abdul Razak, who was a complete secularist. He said Islam has nothing to do with government. Taha Hussein, Muhammad Rashid Rida. These were the students of Muhammad Abdu that passed on some of his thoughts. With respect to Muhammad Rashid Rida, after some time he began to realize that in fact what Muhammad Abdu was teaching was wrong, and he began to long after Muhammad Abdu died, he began to criticize his work and point out some of his mistakes. Well, that laid really the groundwork, and those scholars, Muhammad Abdu, the students of Muhammad Abdu, and the students of Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, these are the teachers of the present day modernists. But we do not have time to go into the situation of the present day modernists, what influence they are, what role they're playing today. So I think just dealing with the history of the modernists or modernist school will be sufficient for today, and then we'll open the floor now for any questions or comments that you may have. So now that we're finished, we can give a title to this. This is the history of the modernist movement before the present time. That's the title of this lecture. So on the tape, you can go back.
What you mentioned about Muhammad Abdu, proven in his books or...
Muhammad Abdu is not very controversial. Jamāl al-Afghani, that's a different story, which is one of the reasons why I can't skip it. But Muhammad Abdu is very clear. There's no real controversy over Muhammad Abdu. I don't know. What do you mean, the next in this series? Hey, the next lecture in this series is the situation of this movement at this time, now. And what are they propagating today? Obviously, since they're modernists, they cannot propagate the same thing that they propagated 100 years ago. They have to change. They have to keep up with the times. So the next one is what are they doing today, and also their influence in the Muslim world, especially the United States. I think when I originally prepared these lectures, it was for a mixed American and foreign audience. So I have quite a bit here about their role in the United States today.
First of all, I have to say that it was a big mistake not to get the title during the khutbah. After the khutbah, the I'lam.
But that's, actually this Ahmed Jabbar, since he's here, he's supposed to get tafsir tonight. But he refused.
Second thing, I wonder, since now nowadays, Muhammad Abdul is like an idol to a lot of people.
Yeah,
But
unfortunately.
the way that he said things, I would assume that there was a lot of opposition to him.
Yes.
How come this opposition is not really known or not talked about in modern history?
Yani who opposed him?
Who opposed him? I would assume that there a lot of people would
Yeah.
shouldn't have shower.
No. And there were people like Shakir and his two sons. I keep forgetting who was the father. Muhammad Shakir is the father, and then Ahmed and Mahmoud is his two sons.
Ahmed Mahmoud. His son, Muhammad Mahmoud.
And Muhammad Shakir is the father.
Ahmed Shakir.
Oh, Ahmed Shakir is the father? طيب, Ahmed Shakir opposed him very hard, in a very difficult, not very, in a harsh way. Also, Abdurrahman al-Sa'ati, which is Hassan al-Banna's father, also opposed him. But why Muhammad Abdul and you don't know the others? Because Muhammad Abdul had the backing of the English government, the Egyptian government, and the ruling, the upper class. Okay, people like, the people who were dominating the media or what were popular in the city, and they were all people of Muhammad Abdul's followers. Sa'd Zaglul and his wife opened a bunch of salons for people to come and sit and talk, and so he had the government backing of both the British and the Egyptian government, and he also had the backing of the upper class. So the upper class, that time they used to travel to Europe and come back and so forth. So therefore, that's why basically you hear one side of the story. And those who opposed him, who didn't really have, except for maybe 4 people following them, this is the case everywhere.
What
Yeah, he opposed him. You can find these people who opposed him. Many of them were writers. Many of them are famous, but because of his influence and his situation, they were kind of drowned out by. Even Muhammad Rashid Rida, if you read his later writings, he opposed him. But if you ask anyone who's Muhammad Rashid Rida, he's the best student of Muhammad Abdul. He wrote Tarikh al-Imam and so forth, the life history of Muhammad Abdul. So what you may hear may not necessarily represent what was actually going on. Also, for example, Jamāl al-Afghani was opposed by many people. Similar situation from him, concerning him. Now, Jamāl al-Afghani, he's the one where you can't tell what's true and what's false. His life is really confusing. And also, because he was so influential, anyone who came after him with any idea, he says, I get this idea from Jamāl al-Afghani. He's my teacher, he's the one who taught me this. If you want to give some authority to what you're saying, at that time you say, well, this is what al-Afghani told me. So people were claiming many things that this is Afghani's teachings. Some of them were not true. But even his own personal life, and for example, you hear a lot that he was a pan-Islamist, and he's saying that the Muslim countries should all get together and rise against the West. Actually, he never taught that. And he taught that the Eastern countries, Muslim or non-Muslim, should rise against the rule. Should rise against the rule of the French and the Dutch. He never mentioned English for some reason. Actually, it was the English he was supposed to be killed in Russia. By the way, he believed in assassination as a way of. He was, I guess, the first terrorist in the Muslim world, and he believed in assassination. And he tried to assassinate the ruler of Iran. He was captured in Russia, and he was supposed to be put to death. And it was the British government that came and rescued him. طيب No, he didn't say it's next week.
No.
He didn't say that. He didn't say it's next week.
Come on. It's a good topic.
No, these topics will be consequent and yeah, products. And one every week, or it doesn't matter?
No, it doesn't matter. Now?
It is very hard. These thoughts are coming from them, like believing in Darwinism.
The problem is people don't read what they actually wrote. You know, they just hear about these people. Afghani was a great leader. Many people, they think I named myself after Jamāl al-Afghani. And everyone asks me, oh, did you name yourself after Jamāl
It's
al-Afghani?
because we don't see anything coming from Muslim leaders or Muslim ulama regarding this. I've never heard
Yeah, that's
about Rushdie.
no, yeah, that's part of the problem also. Even the ones alive today, and some of them are considered the leading, for example, in the United States, some of them are considered the leading scholars and callers to Islam. But if you actually look at some of their fatwa, some of their things that they wrote and said, you will not believe that this came from those people.
You mentioned in the beginning of the lecture that this is a new movement. Is that true?
I said it's a very old, actually, method.
Yeah, but no, I mean, you said that.
It is reappearing.
Right,
It is, since the turn of the century.
right.
It has reappeared
In the
under the
same-
influence of the European modernism.
Same form.
Hey, basically putting al-aql first.
So now you are going to move to the new people. That
Yes. This was just development. As I said, the students of these people that I mentioned some of their students, they are the teachers of the ones around today.
And that is because the West is feeling that maybe there's also the Ahl Sunnah now is coming up, and that's why maybe they are trying to support these group, or it's just
I think regardless of
what's going on.
it's in their interest, and regardless of whether there's revival among Ahl Sunnah or not, it's in their interest for people to think of themselves as Muslims and be following the way of Europe.
I think they can put more effort if they feel.
Hey, okay, yeah, come on, but even if that's during the time of Muhammad Abdu, it wasn't very strong. Things were actually in a very bad. Jamāl al-Qasimi in Syria, in Damascus, to be more specific. He was one of those reformers at the same time who looked at things differently. He said, look, we have lots of problems, but the solution is not following the West completely. The solution is going back to the Qur'an and Sunnah. The situation in the Muslim world was very bad at that time, from Islamic point of view. But even though it was bad, and really the Muslims weren't doing anything, they still had Muhammad Abdu and these people and supported them and tried to spread this way.
Okay, the question is, one can conclude from this speech that he cannot use his mind.
Oh, okay, we'll get to that.
Okay.
We'll get to the position of aql in Islam.
Yeah, because if something is not against the religion, it's not against the Quran and Sunnah,
No.
I think it's okay. And Sayyid Muhammad Qutb, who was talking about that,
No.
he said, I'm not going to talk about, if you wear a short jilbab or, make it longer, because this is just how to appear. But if you appear inside as a good Muslim, so this is much better than you take care of if you wear a jilbab or if you wear a pants and shirt, So, if these famous scholars, they are talking about bringing something from Western or from the United States or anything, it's not against the Sharia and Sunnah. I don't think.
No, the problem is that what they're saying is against the Quran and Sunnah.
Some of them. You mentioned some of them when you were talking about jinn or something like that. But you also mentioned he brings the new method of wearing the pants and shirt to other countries. So, because it is haram to wear libas al-kuffar. yeah, who said it?
هذا حديث you cannot appear like the kuffar. What do you mean? This hadith of the Prophet ﷺ.
Well, that's what I said.
So at that time, if someone is wearing a specific dress, you know that he's European and he's non-Muslim. And you know both of these things. هذا لباس الكفار. Someone wears that, you know that he is kafir. Okay? That's the situation in Egypt at that time. So he is saying,
if you wear a pants and shirt, so you feel like a kafir. No. Okay,
if the Prophet ﷺ prohibited to dress like the kuffar, and he said whoever appears like a people, he's one of them. Okay.
During the time of the Prophet ﷺ, some people wearing pants and shirts.
The point is, if there's a dress, if there's a dress which is known to be the dress of the kuffar, you cannot wear it.
Yeah, I know. That's
okay. So in Egypt at that time, the pants and suit were known to be the dress of the kuffar. Well, Muhammad Abdul said, you may wear it, there's no problem with it.
Okay, but this means, the way he's saying it, you mean that he intended to do that. He intended for the Muslim people in Egypt to imitate the kuffar.
Yes, he did.
But I don't think he means that, because...
No, his writings are very clear that the Muslims must follow the Europeans in both their aqidah, in their akhlaq, in their physical sciences, in their material, their aqidah about the world, not leaving the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but their belief about the world, the place of Apple, philosophy. He said these things very clearly. There's no question about it. That for the Egyptians to become civilized, he wasn't talking about Muslims in general. He said for the Egyptians to become civilized, they have to follow the way of the Europeans, including akhlaq. And Qasim Amin was even more.
Yeah, Qasim Amin. Okay.
Yeah, Qasim Amin. His book was actually written by Muhammad Abdul. This was Muhammad Abdul's writings. Him and Qasim Amin.
The only thing that I'm not convinced about, if something is not existing in the era of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, فدلوقتي what we should do, even the scholars, they're trying to find, you find to study it, because you cannot find it in this trying to think.
No one disagrees with you, on that point.
Yeah. So now we have cars. We don't have cars at the time of the Prophet Muhammad. Now we have pants and chairs. We don't have that at that time. So people, they have to decide. They have to have a lot of experience a lot of reading about these books and Sharia and the Fiqh and all that, and then he would
that's no problem. But to accept something, if it goes against the Qur'an and Sunnah, to accept something, just because it's the way of some other people and you're going to put that first, this is wrong.